the Community Foundation's first in a series of Let's Talk activities and events. We're very happy you've made time to be with us today. We will do these monthly throughout the end of the year and might likely continue them into 2021. We want to thank you for making time to be with us. These are short times together to delve into various sectors in the mission-driven sector to learn about what's going on, how the pandemic and other challenges are affecting what's happening, and what we might be able to do to take philanthropic, voluntary, and sort of charitable action to improve the quality of life in Tompkins County. This is very much a role for a community foundation. Traditional role within the community foundation world is called convening and catalyzing. And we certainly are convening all of you today, and we hope to catalyze some actions that help improve issues around K-12 schools. Our guest for our inaugural launch of Let's Talk is Dr. Jeffrey Matteson, who's the superintendent of Tompkins-Seneca-Tioga BOCES. We're very happy to be with you. Jeff has some prepared remarks. And then, as I mentioned a little bit earlier before we formally began our time together, if you have questions, we'd like you to submit those into the chat box. You can either do that to everyone, or if you'd like it to be an anonymous question, you can direct that to Nancy Masici and Amy Levere from the Community Foundation, who are tracking those questions and will let us know when we get those. Let's Talk is a sort of modified part of our agenda for this year. Some of you might recall the 2020 is our 20th anniversary year. We had a lot of celebratory activities planned, and we really wanted to retool and sort of renovate what we're doing in a way that lets us connect with each other and use technology to understand more of what's going on in the mission-driven sector and to see what kind of actions we might take. So we have 5 of these scheduled. Our next one up is Wednesday, September 2nd. Liddy Barger from the Human Services Coalition will focus on housing topics. We have additional sessions scheduled in October and November around food security and workers. And our third opportunity in December is open. We're going to be scheduling that, but we'd love to have your input on who you might like to hear or what topics you'd like us to cover. So with that, I think we've covered all the logistics. I'll turn it over to you now, Jeff. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, George, and thank you for the opportunity. Good morning, everybody. This is obviously a pretty busy time for schools, and our higher ed institutions and K-12 institutions are very busy trying to figure things out about really something that's never been done before, and that is the reopening of educational institutions. And we got to, while our data looks good, it is still during the pandemic. When you look at the data for the whole country, the data is not good. And we don't have a plexiglass border around New York State. So we know we remain vulnerable to the least safe person that we can interact with. And I already see some great questions that have come in, and I'll try to cover them while I share some brief remarks for information on reopening, because they're the perfect questions, the right kind of things to be thinking about. But our biggest concerns are not that we don't know how to educate children. I mean, we have a lot of professionals that know how to do this, and we've put some great things in place for in-person instruction prior to the pandemic. Students perform pretty well in this region. Some wonderful things happen, and some wonderful futures are created as a result of the public system, the private system, and our higher educational system. How do you do this and keep people safe at the same time and not create hotspots, having your parents and students feel safe when they come to your school system, not to mention all the people that we employ, and being able to staff an institution during a pandemic and be effective is going to be a great challenge for us. We're only literally a month away from needing to really, and we're in a little bit of a holding pattern as we've built out initial plans with the information that we are given from the Department of Health and the State Education Department. We know the governor has a decision to make these next couple of days, and then our data will tell us what will actually happen by the time September 9th, 10th, 11th, whichever date people choose that they're going to reopen, rolls around. So the biggest issues for us currently are ensuring we have personal protective equipment and some of the more advanced personal protective equipment for the healthcare workers that will interact with students if they come with any symptoms, or if an adult happens to come to our campus with any symptoms. So it's not as simple as just making sure we have masks for everyone available. A lot of people will bring their own, but we also know there will be those who don't have access or need replacements in a short period of time, and they just can't afford to the challenge is we can't afford to be constantly purchasing all this for our entire school community either. So those are going to be some challenges for us long term, depending on how long we have to have those kind of mitigating interventions introduced to the educational system.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, at TST BOCES, and this refers to one of the questions, we have set up plans for where there would be separate from the nurse's office. We would have a separate place for the campus where if anyone came with a temperature or they hadn't done the screening from home and had to do the screening when they came to our campus and they had to answer no to any of our questions, they immediately go to that infirmary and we start connecting them with our resources to have an intervention with that individual. Well, that's a different level of PPE for a school nurse or whoever happens to be manning that infirmary area than, and the simples are there to pick up the meds. So we got to have different processes and procedures for that as well. So we've set up separate places, and that actually is a requirement in the Department of Health guidance to set up these separate places. And we're very fortunate that we have in our Smith School, we do have a large space that we've now carved out that we used to have. It's a very large conference room, events in, and since no events are happening, we're going to convert that to our infirmary. All of these things cost money and none of it happens for free, right? So
Right.
you're talking about present money trying to pull that off. Barriers, we've got lots of barriers placed up. So do your school districts have been installing barriers, and of course, state education requirements. It has to be polybicarbonate. It can't be plexiglass because it has to be something that can't catch fire, which is, those things are 4 times as expensive as plexiglass. So some of these things are our current requirements make the mitigating interventions much more expensive. Cleaning supplies, and we can get by early on. And this is why usually my message is, can we reopen? Absolutely. Can we sustain the reopening for an extended period of time under those rules? Questionable. As far as how many students we can have at any given time with this amount of expense. Not that it's not worth the expense. That's not what I'm saying. It's just it is expensive to do it and continue to educate at the levels we are educating. We have obviously challenges with transportation, and all of our school districts have done surveys with parents to see who would be willing to drop off their students rather than have them ride buses. We know all of that would get easier if we were able to put together some kind of reimbursement or gas cards for families who would be willing to transport their children, so we didn't have as many students on buses. That allows us to have more students at school since we have to social distance them on the buses. There's another factor we're thinking about. And another factor we're thinking about is the HVAC systems and some areas that may not have the same level of filtration as others. We have requirements. Any space with SED, there has to be 15% of outdoor air being pumped through. So we can't simply upgrade it to a tighter filter and all of a sudden slow down the amount of fresh air coming into our system. It makes it more dangerous instead of less dangerous. And that's a nuance that most people don't quite understand from the beginning. It's not as simple as putting a more advanced filter in, and some of the systems can't take that filter and work effectively. So all of these things are factors. And for example, we have a couple spaces that have their own filtration and really should only have one person in that. So even when we brought back some office folks, only one individual is allowed to work there, and that's their space. There's no interaction with others coming in and out because it's not as filtered as others. So there's lots of workarounds that we have to do, but these are core things just to get open. We have the faculty and staff to do it, not to mention the plans for how to respond if we do have a case. We have part of our plans will involve the constant communication with the health department. If we do get a case, whether we may need to close a classroom, or we may need to close a wing, or we may need to close a building, or we may need to close a district. So we're looking at the all of the above approach, and not saying that if we get a case, the entire place shuts down, because that may not be the requirement. It may be a person was tested over the weekend and hadn't interacted with people for days. We may not need to shut the whole place down after we do the tracing with the county. So our county has done a wonderful job staying in constant communication with us. And so we believe we're prepared to respond to these. Got to be something I'm missing. We're not going to know until we open what things might not be there.
Yeah.
As far as testing and screening, that is one of those items that has a little bit of a curveball this week from the governor, especially with some public pronouncements he's been making that have been a little bit confusing to the public because of what the very clear Department of Health guidance from his Department of Health was, that schools are not testers, and they wanted us to go with the CDC guide, plus screening practices in place, and let the screening lead to the testing and the tracing. We did receive a clarification from the governor's office today, and that is indeed still the request, that we have robust screening procedures and that the screening leads to the testing and the tracing, which doesn't require us to change all that much other than to communicate to people that that is our plan, that we will be screening tightly, and that will testing. One thing that folks don't know is that insurance companies are not required to cover the COVID test if it's not a script from a doctor. So for us to do mass screening, again, there's a massive expense to do that. If we were required to do the mass screening before anyone could step foot on a school campus, we do what was required, but we would need a funding source to do what is required. So those things remain an open question, and we'll see what happens over the next month if level feels comfortable with that guidance moving forward. We are working as a region with Tioga Medical on our screening app for students and adults, so that it's just-in-time information, so that it's immediately triggers a telemedicine appointment the second someone answers no to a question. So it's not a requirement of a district administrator be making the decisions. We shouldn't be keeping health data that should be protected on our school campuses or our school computers. We're trying to avoid that as much as possible and do our part for keeping our people safe by setting up the mitigation on our campuses, and then being available for the health department and medical personnel to do the tracing, and we can help resource that rather than acting as the medical professionals and like doing the testing and some of this. We've had sick individuals come to schools since schools have been open forever. So we've always had to deal with sick individuals, but not in the middle of a pandemic with something that seems to spread so quickly and can create hotspots very quickly. So,
Jeff, I'd like to open it up to some more questions now, if we might. And I know that Nancy and Amy are keeping track of what's being sent. But before I go to Nancy for the first question, just a general logistical question. I don't have school-age children in my household, but I understand, and I want to check, see whether I'm correct on this, that each of the 6 school districts in Tompkins County has announced their plans about the options they have and the start dates, so people know what those are now. That was not the case as recently as a month ago. Is that correct? So folks in districts know what's happening in each district. Is that true?
They have access to the plans.
Okay.
But I think the open dates, as far as how much training we're going to have to do, now that we have the plans, now we have to get into real detailed logistics like even we're looking at, we may have to move an additional conference day to the beginning of the school year to ensure all of our faculty and staff have enough training to be able to
Right.
pull off the model we're producing. So you may see school get delayed 1 or 2 days
Uh-huh.
past to ensure that all of our people are safe, that people are well trained, that all the curriculum is built the way it needs to be done, and any modifications to logistics of bringing people on our campus and off campus are fully in place.
Okay. Thank you. Nancy, do you have a first question for us?
Yeah, Jeff, thank you for this. This is for students not in the building. What are broadband requirements that you have? And also curious about what the rural groups, vulnerable households might need. And eventually, will BOCES offer a digital code writing training?
Oh, that sounds great. That's a good tip. We'll be keeping that chat. And I'll make sure we talk to our CTE folks and our adult ed folks. It's a great idea. Our broadband requirements, obviously, we love every family to have access to broadband. And that's one of the reasons that we've prioritized the youngest children's special ed children without access for the in-person instruction first. And then we've built out plans based on that baseline because they may need to be at school to get their broadband. And if we can do some in-person, a lot could be downloaded and brought home even if they don't have access to broadband. All the content they've been able to download while they're at school, even if they're only at school 1 or 2 days a week, we can get, that's why we need advanced planning so they get access to all of this stuff before they go back to their homes if they don't have broadband. It really is getting devices in their hand while they're at school to start that can help us mitigate the lack of broadband at home. That being said, that doesn't help us if we suddenly have to close down for a month again and we've still got this gap. So one of the things that the collective BOCES in general of New York have been doing is we have these regional information centers that are usually groups of 4 BOCES, that there's a tech backbone to all the BOCES, and also they provide the internet to all of the school districts in the BOCES region, a lot of tech support, do a lot of tech purchasing through them, some personnel through them. The 12 regional information centers for the state, and almost every school district is tied to one of the information centers, regional information centers. Ours is the Central New York Regional Information Centers through OCM BOCES. This serves both our BOCES and all of our school districts. They have a brand new contract with an outfit called Kajit. That is a very inexpensive way to access the internet for some of these homes. I'm not extremely well versed on how it's working, but a lot of our school districts are taking advantage of it to try to get it in place before the start of school. So there's one way we're trying to get access to families that's less expensive than buying a $45 a month piece from Verizon so they can get it through their phone line. So as a region, and I'm talking the large Central New York region and all the other large regions tied to regional information centers. So this is kind of behind the scenes stuff that is occurring that will get as much in place by September, but we're not going to solve the broadband problem by September. We know that we were given word, we had a meeting with the commissioner on Tuesday, and she said the state is going to make a proposal in October about trying to close this gap, but that gets us through 2 months of school where we had this gap, and that's the investment it's going to take. And every day we're losing time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And
Anecdotally, I heard Trumansburg was successful in getting everybody broadband except for 2 households.
Yeah, and that's kind of how it's going. They know the kids. They know every single one that has access and which one doesn't. That's the one upside to what we learned from the spring. They're able to get down right to the family and try to solve these one family at a time, while the policy folks are trying to solve the problem permanently, because there's one thing to Band-Aid this to get school open. It's another thing to ultimately finally solve the problem.
Yeah, and there's a question in the chat box also about previously, years ago, there was some work at the Tompkins County legislature level about looking at broadband writ large, and what is the connection with that effort, which seems to have somewhat waned, and what you're doing. Don't need an answer to that now, but any way in which we can increase collaboration and coordination across various sectors so it doesn't get sort of segregated just to schools or just to those households with school-age children would be advantageous as well.
Yeah, I mean, municipal broadband has a for it, but also a lot of things interfering because of who already owns the work
Yep.
in the state and what those rules were, which were very lax and very low standard to say that you actually were offering broadband to an area. So really, municipal broadband is the answer for families, but there's also some pretty severe roadblocks to that in regulation, and a lot of those lines have been sold, and so it probably would end up being solved in litigation, to be honest with you.
Probably, yeah. Amy, do you have a question?
I do. So this one also is along the lines of working across different sectors. Regarding transportation, are there any efforts to work with TCAT to readjust some of their routes or schedules to accommodate students to and from BOCES as an alternative to parents dropping off students or the busing situation?
Yeah, I don't know what their specific conversations have been with TCAT. Transportation problem. I wouldn't want to say one way or the other. We've been working on TCAT on some other issues, but not that particular one.
Good. And Nancy, do you have an additional question at all?
I don't, but maybe you answered this in about children who are asymptomatic. Is there universal precautions?
Yeah, part of our screening is that, you know, we're going to be taking temperatures and making sure everyone has filled to going into a classroom, and those that haven't completed it will do it on campus. So we're trying our best, but obviously with asymptomatic, there may not be a fever there. We're just going to have to monitor very closely, and hopefully through some more community testing opportunities, we can discover if we have asymptomatic people around. But we don't have a screening of everyone by testing them before they enter campus.
Jeff, I know you were on an earlier webinar this week hosted by the Chamber of Commerce talking about federal and state governmental concerns of budgetary cuts. And can you give us a sort of a sense of what the picture looks like for school funding, understanding that local municipalities have their own concerns and in terms of sales tax revenue, but most school budgets are based upon property tax revenue, correct?
Correct. And our biggest issue is not some direct funding for reopening, even though that's in like the Senate bill, which would be great. We'll take it, obviously. But it depends what the rules are. If it's, you only get money if 100% of the kids are there every single day, well, under the rules we've been given from the Department of Health. The biggest issue is some funding for states and municipalities, especially state government, because we, especially our region, and a lot of regions of the state receive a lot of state aid. And right now, the state is approving funding requests, but only at 80% of the request. For our library media specialist service here at BOCES, we got our grant and they withheld 20% of it and said it's they can only give you the money that they have. And so we're pretty sure our September aid will be 20% short to our school districts. And so the state budgets need to be backfilled so they can release the full amount of aid. If we don't get the full amount of aid, I don't know how we fund the full school year under these rules without having to go basically fully remote. And that's just not the best scenario for our kids, and have the kind of gaps that can happen with on a full remote. We're very concerned about them putting some funding for state and municipalities to ensure they don't have to withhold aid to school districts.
You had also talked earlier about the issues for the faculty and staff in schools in terms of when they might work at school A, but they might live in District B, and if there's differential about what happens there, how does that affect your workforce as well, along with things like furloughing if you don't get full funding and those sort of things, right?
Correct. Under the federal act, a parent is allowed some time. And so we can end up with an intermittent situation where, depending on what community the parent lives or the employee lives in and may have children going to school, if their children only go to school Monday, Tuesday, we may not have that employee for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, unless we could find a workaround to have them telework. And every school district's going to have that issue. Yep. Because all the schedules are a little bit different and the age of their children are a little bit different. So it's very complex. It's not simple.
A lot of moving parts. Nancy, do we have another question?
Yeah, this one is about Tompkins County Health Department. Have they developed guidelines for schools for medical providers in particular? There was a time when other communicable diseases were developed with some protocols in place and guidelines, and that's the question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I know that the school health providers are in constant communication with the health department. Last Tuesday, we had a meeting with our superintendents via Zoom and some health professionals when we were talking about the screening applications that the entire region would use. It's not just a TST product. Many of the school districts are signing on that too as well. And the health professionals are there. I don't know what protocols they've put together or additional trainings for the nurses. I just know that their antenna are up. They're asking a lot of great questions. They're giving us great things to think about. And I'm glad we still have some time before that's going to come up over the next few weeks.
I'd like to squeeze in one more question before we leave. For those who can stay, it's regarding BOCES. What if a high school student has chosen the online option, and what do you do about those kinds of schedules, including transportation?
Yeah, BOCES is in-person virtual. So in other words, we're open every day for all the students that can come, but we're putting our content as much as possible, the content classrooms or Schoology, so that students can have access to it remotely. And then we may have a family say, we want access to the content, but we only want them coming up once a week for some labs, for some of the hands-on stuff for one of the courses. So yes, we're in person, we're available in person every day, but that's not what's going to happen. We know that people are making different choices depending on their school district model, and we're just trying to leave it as flexible as possible and putting as much content as we possibly can, access to it when they're not able to come in person.
We are at 12 o'clock. This is a fast-paced and information-dense half an hour. I want to thank Jeff for being with us for our first Let's Talk. Encourage folks to check out our website at cftompkins.org. You should be seeing the next in our series. It's on September 2nd, again from 11:30 to 12. Let's Talk Housing with Liddy Barger from the Human Services Coalition. And I want to thank each one of you for sort of beginning to learn about all the complexities about what's going on and trying to stay up to date. We're happy to be an information source for you. This is not the end. This is sort of the middle and the beginning of sort of what the fall is going to look like. And thank you very much for engaging with the Community Foundation. If there's anything we can do to help, advise, suggest, work with you, collaborate you with how you're thinking about taking philanthropic action, we'd be very happy to do that. You can also send additional questions to us at info@cftompkins.org, and we will find answers out for you. Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.